Chasing Leviathan is a podcast about pursuing truth, one big question at a time through the discipline of listening. Truth is too big to tame, but if we pay close attention, we might get the chance to glimpse something truly magnificent. So please join me in this pursuit, 1 week at a time. Just as we get started here, Dr. Afsaruddin, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got interested in religious studies, in Islamic studies, and particularly this discussion of jihad?
Okay, so my interest really in Islamic studies per se began as an undergraduate. So when I was an undergraduate, and this was at Oberlin College in Ohio, I was actually determined to be an economist and a political scientist to boot. I was very interested in the social sciences. I just thought it was very practical. The political world seemed very interesting. So I enjoyed all my politics courses. At that time, the department was called the Department of Government, and I was very interested in comparative politics. So I took a number of courses, and they were fine. But then someone told me that to be taken credibly as a political scientist, particularly someone who was interested in majoring in the Middle East, you would have to take economics because, of course, the oil boom was on, and you had to understand the politics of oil, right? And in order to do that, you also understand the economics of oil. So I took my first economics course. Guess what? I found out very soon that I was simply not cut out for economics. I just could not wrap my brain around it. It just seemed so dry. It seemed somehow divorced almost from reality or from human beings, right? Because it was very mathematical, it was formulaic. It just wasn't for me. So I realized that I probably should not pursue my graduate studies in political science, especially Middle East politics. So that was kind of a rude awakening. But then I took my first Arabic course at Oberlin. We had a visiting professor from Ohio State who was a very gifted teacher of Arabic. And when he started offering his courses, I thought, I should definitely take this course since I'm interested in the Middle East. And I did, and absolutely fell in love with the language. And my background is Muslim. I am a Muslim. And so I already had a natural interest in Arabic and also a natural interest in Islam. So I figured, well, maybe this could be for the long haul. Why don't I think of going to graduate school in Arabic and Islamic studies? I love the language. I wanted to keep pursuing learning it. I wanted to read all the great literary works in Arabic and then also learn more as a scholar about the faith that I was born into. So, well, as they say, the rest is history. So I applied for graduate school in Arabic and Islamic studies into several Middle Eastern studies departments. And Johns Hopkins was, a renowned university and had a very well-regarded professor in Arabic and Islamic studies. So I applied. I got in. They gave me a very handsome financial aid package, and the deal
Always
was
helpful.
Yes, that was extremely helpful. So I continued my studies of Arabic, and I continued my study of Islam and the Middle East. And when I got my PhD, I got my first teaching position at Harvard. Again at a very renowned department of Near Eastern languages and civilizations. I spent 3 glorious years there, and I say glorious particularly because not only was it fun to teach these very gifted students, but also because of the resources that were available there. They had an amazing library. That gave me the opportunity to finish up to finish up the revisions to my dissertation, my PhD dissertation, prepare that for publication as a book. And practically any book or article that I needed, I could find at Widener Library. So that really sped things up for me. So that placed me in a very good position for my first tenure track position, which I got at the University of Notre Dame after I taught at Harvard for 3 years. As a lecturer, that was not a tenure track position, so that was definitely a dead end position. But I was at Notre Dame then for 13 years. I got my tenure there. I wrote my first book there. In fact, actually, I published 2 books while I was still there. And then Indiana University had a senior position in their Department of Near Eastern Languages and Cultures. So I didn't quite make it out of Indiana, remained a Hoosier. Uh, but, I've been very happy here. Indiana has been a very congenial academic home, great
Hmm.
colleagues and so forth. So, yeah, that's sort of my academic life in a nutshell.
Oh, that's awesome. I actually lived for 5 years about a mile from Notre Dame
Oh,
when I
did
was
you?
younger. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Where was that?
It's I'm sorry.
Which city was it? Was it Elkhart or
South Bend. No, I mean we
Goshen?
were,
Oh, you lived in
Ironwood
South Bend.
Drive. Yeah,
Oh,
Ironwood
yes, yes,
Drive
of
that
course.
like leads.
Yeah,
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 we lived on Ironwood
yeah.
Drive. Yeah.
Oh, you did.
So
So
we
that
could
is
hear.
South Bend. Yeah, yeah.
Oh yeah, we could hear the pep band practice at night. So fond memories of people. I don't
That's
think people
right. That's
know.
right.
Yeah, I think it's the oldest marching band, Notre Dame. But
Yeah.
yeah.
That's funny.
So
Actually, that's one thing I do not miss the football weekends because we lived fairly close to the campus. And so
yes,
any weekend they had a game, we could not venture out of our home.
yeah,
We just had to shutter ourselves and then wait till the next day to do all our chores for the weekend. So,
yes.
yeah,
It was football
that's
or
one thing.
nothing. Yeah, you either enjoyed the football or you bared with it. Yeah,
Yeah, yeah,
uh,
that's right.
bore with it. Bore with it. The So uh, today we're talking about, and I have it here, striving in the path of God. I did not get the dust jacket, which made me sad, but really interesting work. Loved what I've been able to get into. How did you get interested, especially about jihad and this concept? And even it looks like you're kind of, as I'm looking at it, reclaiming some of the complexities of the concept of jihad.
That's right. Well, actually, 9/11 had a lot to do with it. So
Mm,
after September 11, as you might imagine, there was a lot of talk about terrorism, militancy, and inevitably, the way the media played it up, they almost always associated with Islam and Muslims, right? Um, so it got to the point where you realize that all we were getting was this kind of unadulterated, monolithic view of Islam as a very violent religion. And Muslims, because they practice jihad, and most of the people didn't even know what that Arabic term meant, but jihad became a very scary word, and people reflexively associated with militancy, with violence, and
mm,
especially violence directed against Westerners, right? That somehow Islam was unable to coexist peacefully with other religions, and Muslims are incapable of living as peaceful citizens in the West outside of the Islamic heartlands. So, of course, already as someone who was quite familiar with Islamic history, I just knew that this was a very skewed picture, not just me, but many of my colleagues. We were constantly being asked to appear in front of television cameras. I was kept very busy in South Bend, by the way. I was pretty much known as kind of the lone Muslim expert on things Islamic. So whenever they needed a commentator on one of their shows, guess who called up? Who they called
yes,
up?
yes.
After, I was terrified at first, but then I kind of got used to the idea. And also, I told myself if I didn't do it, if I did not step up to the
Mm,
plate, there are a number of very ignorant people who'd be happy to do it for me. And they would simply
yes.
perpetuate, right? The same stereotypes and the same misconceptions and so forth. And then I thought to myself, well, I am looking around for a second topic, a
Mm,
topic for a second book. Why not this? This is about as topical as you can get. It's very
yeah.
timely, and also it would be a learning process for me. Although I knew, sort of the broad contours of what jihad meant, and historically what has been the different meanings and significances of the term. I actually had not carried out a sustained scholarly historical study of the term and the relevant literature. So I thought,
Mm,
well, there has never been a better time to start doing that now. So I actually wrote a proposal and submitted to a number of granting agencies to see if I could get a major grant that would allow me to go on sabbatical for a year and start the research for the book. I mean, this was a huge venture. We're talking about so many different genres of literature that I would have to look at. Obviously,
Yeah.
religious texts, but also literary texts, historical texts, legal texts, and so forth. And fortunately, I did get a very generous grant from the Harry Frank Guggenheim Foundation, which allowed me to go on leave for a whole year. So I started the research for that. Now, that year was spent only in reading texts. I mean, this is a big topic, right? So that's
Yeah.
all I did for most of the year, reading, taking notes, collecting my thoughts, trying to see, where all this would lead me to. So a couple of years later, I applied for another major grant, got it. And this was the year when I was finally able to sit down and write the book. Well, the book came out in 2013. So now I forget the exact year, but I think I was on leave from 2007 to 2008. I may be getting the years a little wrong, but when the book finally came out in 2013, I had been actually working on this project for about 8 years. And that's how long it took me to digest all this information, right? Because there's such a wealth of material. So September 11 sort of proved to be the stimulant for my getting interested in the topic. And then the long gestation process, during which I conceived of the plan for the book and the actual writing. And finally, it seen the light of day in 2013. I have to confess that I wrote this as a scholarly book for specialists, but I've also been pleased by the reaction from non-specialists who said, if they can avoid a lot of the getting, bogged down in a lot of the Arabic terms, and I think this is also a challenge for you if you don't know Arabic, and most people don't, even academics don't. But if you can sort of skim past that, I think you would be able to get sort of the larger ideas that I'm proposing in the book. And as you said, restoring kind of the complexity to this topic and not just reduce the complexity of this topic to a soundbite or two, right? Which is what we get from the media.
Yes. For just about everything, but especially for like a topic like this that deserves a complex treatment. I just want to say, as I was able to get into it, I actually really appreciate it. I come from a religious studies background, and I went into hermeneutics for the Bible, and so a lot of the exegetical passages you have are very familiar from a Greek standpoint. Like I was like, it actually felt very like I was like, oh, this is I feel at home here, and so I appreciate that kind of linguistic work and the rigor that goes into that and the way that it grounds a lot of these arguments. One thing that I found, and this is just an example of the way that you talk about the dominant juridical and political formation of the concept of jihad, that it's primarily political, that sort of thing. I'd always heard jihad translated as holy war, but in here you talk about, when you look at the literal translation, is striving in the path of God, which of course is completely different, right? Like it's not completely different, but it's like that's very, very different, and you could immediately see how you could use that in multiple ways. Even the way you talked about martyrdom and the translation of that from Arabic is dying in the path of God, which again is that opens up a multitude of interpretations. And I personally find a lot of value in reclaiming what we have rather than just trying to immediately cut off and distance ourselves. A lot of times when we do that, we create, I think, holes in ourselves, and we often are bound to repeat certain issues instead of growing from the healthy roots that we're given. So kind of, with that said, with those kind of simple, like the simple things that I picked up, what are some common misconceptions that you often see with jihad, and how would you, in a more complex way, define jihad or talk about its different uses?
Mm-hmm. Well, as you pointed out yourself, that one of the takeaways from the book, at least I hope that is a principal takeaway for most readers, is that jihad actually in its basic meaning means striving, struggling, making an effort, usually towards a good end, right? But in general, the basic dictionary sense of the word jihad is struggle. And when you broaden the meaning that way, when you go back to the fundamentals, then you realize this is something that almost anyone can identify with. We're talking about human struggle at all levels, in all spheres of life. The fact that I'm struggling now to find the right words to convey my thoughts to you, that's part of jihad. The fact that you're struggling to convey your understanding of the book, to me, that's part of your jihad too. I sometimes remind my Christian students, when I was at Notre Dame in particular, as you might imagine, we had many observant Catholic students. I would remind them that in the Arabic translation of the Bible, when they talk about jihad, when they talk about Jesus struggling with himself, they use the word jihad. And that might come as a shock to some Christians because they'll think, oh, no, jihad is only something that Muslims do and it's not a good thing. But that's all it is, primarily. That, it simply refers to the struggle of every human being to achieve their full potential in life. There is a fundamental moral imperative within Islam, which can be distilled into a phrase, which states that a Muslim should always command what is good, enjoin what is good, and forbid or prevent what is wrong. Now, in order to do that in all aspects of life, you have to carry out a struggle, right? So the struggle begins with you, your inner struggle. We are all assailed by all kinds of desires, base desires, our impulse to lie, to cheat, to break our promises, all that, right? So the fundamental struggle is within yourself. How can you be a better person by fighting these base desires within yourself, which prompts you to do certain things that are bad, that you should resist as a moral, as a righteous person, right? That's the fundamental definition of struggle. But then there's also a social aspect to it. How can you prevent other people from doing wrong things? How can you prevent them from doing wrong to their neighbors, right? A ruler. There's a very famous hadith, a saying of the Prophet Muhammad, which says, one of the best forms of jihad is to speak a word of truth to a tyrant. And we often describe that as speaking truth to power. Not an easy thing to do. We often have to struggle to carry out that command, right? To speak the truth fearlessly, regardless of what the consequences might be for us. It's probably one of the hardest moral and ethical imperatives for us to live up to, right? So that's what we're talking about. We're talking about many different dimensions of jihad. Now, at the state level, what happens if you're attacked by an aggressor, an enemy, who wants to take control of your land, pillage your property, right? Lay waste to your home and so forth? Of course, under those circumstances, your struggle to fend off the attack and protect yourself, defend yourself, is also part of jihad. So there's also a military aspect to it, especially when the state is involved. One thing that you never pick up from the media is that there's actually a whole protocol for a state to declare war against an aggressor nation. It's always the legitimate head of state who can proclaim such a call to arms. Only the legitimate head of state. So you can't have, like I like to say to my students, you can't have every Tom, Dick, and Ali proclaiming a military jihad, right? It has to be the recognized head of state. And I have a feeling you're familiar with the Christian just war theory, where there's an equal emphasis on how it's the legitimate ruler, the one who is recognized by the citizenry as the legitimate ruler. Only that person can declare war, right? So that's also a fundamental precept within military ethics within Islam. So, of course, this is a big topic, big subject, as you know, because I talk about many of these different dimensions in the book. But in a nutshell, to summarize that, jihad, simply broadly speaking, means struggle on all levels and all spheres of life for a worthy and just cause. And it can be as simple as smiling at your neighbor. And that's your good deed for the day. The struggle to smile at our neighbor, but we may not feel like it, right?
Yeah.
The struggle to say a kind word. The effort we have to put into going an extra mile for someone and carrying out an act of charity, going over to the food bank and making a delivery of cans of food that the poor need. All that falls under the rubric of jihad.
And I think that's something that everyone ultimately agrees with. It's not easy to be a good person. If it was, almost everyone would be, right? Like it takes effort, right?
Yes.
And so I think that makes intuitive sense. And I just want to, it's just the example that you gave. And so I just want to make sure and want to clarify something. You talked about in the social setting, stopping evil as part of the struggle and that's obviously like a negative emphasis. Is that generally true of jihad, or is it also, could producing good in your neighbor also be part of that struggle? Is there also that positive side to it as well?
Yeah. Well, that's why I said that the moral imperative behind the whole impetus for jihad on all levels is the command that one must promote what is good and prevent or forbid what is wrong. So it's really a two-pronged thing, right? I mean, you can't really have one without the other when you think about it. If you're trying to promote good and someone's trying to resist that, then it's also part of your jihad to facilitate the promotion of good, right? Whatever that may be. It may be running for office, public office, and therefore making sure that the community has a representative who represents their concerns, right? And maybe, as public as that, or maybe on a much more modest level, just reprimanding something for trying to do something bad. That would be part of jihad. Or speaking a soft word to allay someone's anger. There can be so many different ways of promoting what is good. And it's all situational, right? There is no formula or magic formula or prescription. People have to still exercise their intellect, and they need to be morally formed as human beings so that they know the difference between good and wrong, and then acting on that knowledge to carry out this moral imperative. So there's both the positive aspect, and then also, as you said, there's also the prevention of doing wrong, which may require, again, sometimes physical means of doing that.
Right. Well, and that makes sense, right? Even if you were just negative, I mean, that's a very empty life. I'm just going to stop evil, but I'm not going to promote what is good. That's not good. And that's what I figured. I just wanted to clarify. Something that you mentioned about the proper protocol that you have to have the head of state. Where is that found? Because one of the more interesting things that you mention in your book is the assessment, kind of the definitions of the authority of hadith and the assessment of that authority. Is that where the protocol for the head of state is found? Where is that protocol found?
So the protocol was actually developed more by jurists. Okay. But then people also point back to the life of the Prophet himself. So there are the two most authoritative sources for legislation, but also for ethical and moral reasoning are, first of all, of course, the Quran, which Muslims believe to be the sacred revelation, divine revelation within Islam, vouchsafed to the Prophet Muhammad. And then secondly, the Sunnah, Sunna, to use a scary Arabic word, which refers to the practices and sayings of the Prophet Muhammad. So the Quran has many broad moral injunctions and principles. Some of the interpretations of those broad moral injunctions and principles are to be found in the hadith literature, where the Prophet himself pronounced on the meanings of some of these verses, right? As you know from your own background in hermeneutics, that there can be multiple interpretations of a single verse in scripture, right? People often bring their own lenses to it. I mean, there are also verses with, of course, obvious common sense meanings and can be taken literally, but there are also a number of statements. Let's just say, for example, the command within the Quran and within Islam, be just. Always be just. Stand up for justice. The Quran proclaims very explicitly, right? And it's reflected in the hadith, the sayings of the Prophet, in the exegetical literature and so forth. But we're not all of one mind on what constitutes justice. And also the concept changes from time to time, from place to place, right? And it all depends on where you are located, right? So this is where the exegesis of these critical verses become extremely important. So the jurists went to great length. They knew that, of course, when the prophet eventually received divine permission to engage the pagan Meccans in battle, because they had aggressed against the Muslims and had committed acts of persecution against them. For 12 years of his prophetic career, Muhammad was not given the permission to engage in armed combat with his enemies in Mecca, right? It was only after he made the emigration to Medina, then the prophet received divine permission to finally engage in defensive warfare. So they have the model of the prophet to point to, that here we have a recognized head of state of his own community, and therefore the legitimate ruler who is able to then give the call to armed combat, right? And so the jurists not only studied the Quran and the Hadith, but they also studied the life of the prophet, and therefore drew examples, precedents from his life, and therefore the detailed protocol that they eventually did lay out in their writings about military ethics and how to go to war included this very basic condition that only the legitimate head of state, recognized as such by the majority of Muslims, could issue such a call. And then there were very strict protocols about how to behave during warfare, right? There was a strict military code of conduct. You could not ever target non-combatants. Civilians automatically had immunity, right? Non-combatant immunity, something that we have enshrined in modern international law, right? The Geneva Conventions protects the rights of civilians. It also, within Islamic law, they also made provisions for humane treatment of prisoners of war, something we also find reflected in modern international law. So we do find rules pertaining to military protocol and the, principles of non-combatant immunity, and the requirement that only the legitimate ruler should engage in warfare. They have been codified in these legal manuals that exist until today.
Is that, and forgive me, when we talk about hadith, what is hadith? Is it those legal manuals?
No. Okay, so let me make a distinction between hadith and legal manuals. Hadith are the actual sayings of the prophet, right? And the sayings of the prophet are always kept distinct from the Quran. So Muslims believe the Quran is direct divine revelation to the prophet.
Got it.
The hadith are his sayings, Muhammad's sayings that are not considered divine in origin. They're his own sayings. And then the legal material developed later when there came into being a class of jurists who studied these sources, the Quran and the hadith. The hadith is almost always interchangeably used with sunnah, but sunnah also refers to the actions of the prophets. Hadith are the sayings,
yes.
But the sunnah also refers to what did he actually do that was not necessarily codified into a statement, right? So hadith and sunnah are often used interchangeably. So the jurists then studied these two sources because by the second or third century of Islam, Islam had become a world civilization practically, right? I mean, you've heard about the Abbasid period, the glorious period, the flowering of Islamic civilization. That actually forms the backdrop, by the way, to the Arabian Nights. When you read the Arabian Nights, they're talking about the Abbasid period, right? If you take out the fantastical tales, no one was riding around in magic carpets, of course. That just didn't happen. That's just fictional.
It's always a disappointment, but okay.
But that is sort of the age of prosperity that forms the backdrop to the Arabian Nights. And the reason for that is it actually became one of the most prominent civilizations of that time. And There were schools and universities cropping up all over the Islamic world. Science and architecture and technology was at a very advanced stage by the standards of the time in the 3rd, 4th, 5th centuries of Islam, which corresponds to 9th, 10th, 11th centuries of the Christian era.
Thank you. I was going to ask. I apologize to keep that straight in my head. Yeah.
Of course, I am so used to doing that, doing the double dating. So to go back to the jurists. So the jurists then, Islamic jurisprudence actually then really took off. There was so much learning, and part of the learning was also religious learning. And so the jurists, having now inherited this growing civilization, had to deal with situations that were not adequately explained, either in the Quran or the Hadith and the Sunnah. So there were, of course, broad moral principles and injunctions, but those had to be parsed, right, in response to new circumstances on the ground. So now that Islam had become this world power, world civilization, how do you deal with people that Muslims came across, often conquered as populations? How do you deal with these citizens, right? How do you deal with their rights? What do you do when you engage people in warfare, an army in a warfare, but they are in the middle of non-combatants, in the middle of civilians? How do you deal with them? So they do refer to hadiths, like the famous one where the Prophet counsels one of his generals when conducting warfare to absolutely make sure that women, children, the elderly were never targeted, because that would actually be a grievous sin, right? It would be a grievous wrong. So we have pointed, explicit commands coming from the Prophet himself that forbids attacking civilians under any conditions. But the jurists also had to go beyond that. There were certain situations that there simply was no precedent for in the existing literature, right? So they used what's known as, in Arabic, I'm going to throw out another scary Arabic word, ijtihad. Their independent reasoning. Jurists also had to fall back on their own reasoning in order to derive new rulings under new circumstances, right? One principle that was often invoked by them was the principle of the common good. Again, that should sound familiar to you. I think the notion of the common good, right, the general welfare of people, is often a motivating factor behind new legislation. How could the jurists derive new legislation that, again, promoted what is good and prevented what is wrong? What is the common good that they are after? Again, perceptions of common good can change with age. So what may have struck our predecessors as part of the common good in the 9th century of the Common Era would not strike us the same way. I mean, think about the situation of women, for example, right? I mean, how drastically our notions of what constitutes gender justice, how drastically that has changed since the pre-modern period, right? Certain things that were taken for granted as being just and humane with regards to women, we would no longer consider being equally just and humane in the modern period, right? The idea that women cannot go out to work, or they should not have access to higher education because their true calling was as mothers and wives. There's nothing wrong with being mothers and wives. But within Islam, women and men are actually supposed to be granted the same opportunities to fulfill themselves, to flourish as human beings. And I think across the board, many religions have actually made that transition where they also understand what constitutes justice within gendered relations to have changed drastically since the pre-modern period, right? So we do evolve. We don't lose sight of our basic principles, but we do evolve in how we understand those principles in any given period or in any given situation. So the jurists were often reacting to the reality on the ground. So realpolitik, realism, hard-headed political realism often guided what they did. Now, sometimes in the course of doing that, they did sometimes turn away from prophetic precedent. I do see that in the literature. And sometimes the motivation for that is we have to defend ourselves under all circumstances. So that means sometimes we have to carry out a military attack, even when we know that women and children are in the midst of the attacking forces. What do? So a greater good can trump a lesser evil. Okay, so unfortunately in war, sometimes you have to make those very, very unpalatable choices, but those choices have to be made. So what's interesting about the legal manuals is you see an evolving legal discourse that's not always religiously based, not always textually based, but they are reacting to the situation on the ground, and they are working as hard-headed, pragmatic jurists, as jurists are often called upon to do so, right? So we often have to remember many of the pronouncements were contingent. They were not meant to be valid for all time and place. Unfortunately, I think there are a number of Muslims who think that whatever the jurist pronounced on in the 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th century are still binding today, even though the circumstances of our world have changed so much, right? And this is where I think the dynamism of a continuing evolving Islamic thinking on a number of these issues comes into play.
Absolutely. And I wanted to address, you said at the beginning that you had to read quite a bit in the literature. Was that almost exclusively juridical literature, or is there uses of jihad that are outside the juridical? What is it? What is jihad like outside of the juridical literature?
Right. So actually in the book, I don't discuss the juridical literature because that has been studied to death. And because people have focused only on the legal literature, they keep promoting the same views. But we have to remind ourselves that those are sometimes the views only of those jurists. They're not necessarily reflecting the tradition as a whole. So I'm very glad that you asked me this question, because for the ordinary person, jihad has nothing to do with fighting or with military activity, right? Jihad for them, what we began our conversation with, is whatever needs to be done at the daily level, right? The daily grind, if you like. Getting up in the morning to go to work, that's part of your jihad. In fact, there are wonderful hadiths that talk about that every time a person embarks on licit means of earning a living, that person earns a reward for carrying out a legitimate jihad. And they're described as being on the path of God. That we talked about how a true struggle is always for the sake of God, right? So such a person is on the path of God. And this is always good news for my students. I always tell them that anyone who embarks on learning and undergoes hardship to acquire an education, that person has carried out jihad as well, right? And I tell my students, hey, you're getting up in the morning, having a quick breakfast, and coming to my class was not in vain. You are carrying out jihad, and you will reap the benefits of this. And I remember one student of mine from rural Indiana, suddenly a light went off in his head, and he said, "You mean every time my father gets up and goes to work, he's carrying out jihad?" And I said, "Yeah, you're absolutely right." And I said, "Are you going to tell your father that?" He said, "No way." He said, "No, my father would be absolutely taken aback and probably shocked if I described his daily grind in that way." Yeah.
Yeah.
So for the ordinary person, it's really about, carrying out your daily activities and doing it for a good, every sacrifice you make for your family, for example, is part of this larger moral imperative of promoting what is good and therefore preventing what is wrong and so forth. Yeah, it's part of your basic jihad.
Yeah, I can't get past this idea that you mentioned that people are only studying the juridical literature, and so they always come up with the same views.
Yeah.
And I was just thinking, if 200 to 500 years from now, if people judged the American culture purely on what lawyers wrote, I think the rest of us would be very frustrated. Like, no, there's so much more to like America as it is right now than just what lawyers think, right? Like, that's a very different, a very specific kind of discourse. I think that's very, very helpful.
Absolutely. Yeah. And also, if you read only official literature, right? Literature produced by public officials. What about the lives of daily, the ordinary lives of citizens, the ordinary citizen? What did these concepts mean to them? So I think a number of us have started weaning ourselves from the legal literature and looking at other sources for producing a more holistic idea of what jihad is. The spiritual aspects of jihad is extremely important. Now, you don't have to be a mystic to practice spiritual jihad, which is sometimes what people think. You don't have to withdraw from life and so forth. No, I mean, spiritual aspects, again, as I said, curbing my desire to speak a sharp word to someone or say an unkind word to someone or backbite or lie or, all that. My struggle to curb those impulses is again part of my daily internal spiritual jihad, and we all carry it all the time, right? So that is, of course, an extremely important part of understanding what jihad means. There's also the social aspects of jihad. Let's say you're fighting to prevent climate change, right? This is a really important concern for us. This is promoting the common good. If our natural resources disappear, you and I are not going to be in very good shape, but particularly our children and grandchildren. Think of that.
Right.
What kind of a world are we going to bequeath to them, right? So being concerned about social issues like that and fighting for social justice, promoting civil rights, the Black Lives Matter movement was one of those really important social justice movements in recent history that I can think of that in some ways has created a sea change in our consciousness. Suddenly we are aware of, there's so many injustices simmering just beneath the surface, and we tend to ignore them until it erupts, right? But we really can't wait that much longer. These are concerns that we need to be engaged with and address right now. That's part of, again, social jihad and trying to reform society, creating a movement for the greater good. All that, again, is part of jihad.
So you've mentioned kind of the daily jihad. And the spiritual side? Is there anything from an arts perspective, like in the literature and in a literary sense, or in paintings or sculptures, where you see representations of jihad? And what can we learn from that?
I'm not sure I can actually point to any artistic representations of jihad. I mean, because how do you represent a concept? But one concept that's very important within the Islamic milieu is that of beauty. And we often don't hear that spoken of very much in the context of Islam and Muslims, certainly not in the media, I think. But there's a very famous saying that God is beauty, and therefore he loves beauty. So anything, again, that creates aesthetic pleasure would definitely, and the effort to create that aesthetic pleasure would actually, of course, be considered part of jihad as well. Yeah.
Oh, very cool. Yeah. And forgive me, the Arabic term escapes me. Very closely linked to all of this discussion is the discussion. It's translated as martyrdom in English, but even as the idea of dying in the path of God, it seems like martyrdom has slightly different connotations from that, even to translate it over into English. Can you talk a little bit about, again, I can't remember the Arabic term, but the way that has played throughout the literature?
So actually, I think the Arabic word you're thinking of is shaheed.
Yes.
Which is usually used to refer to a martyr now. But shaheed is used in the Quran completely differently. It does not mean a martyr in the Quran. It means a witness, simply a witness, either an eyewitness or a legal witness. And God is also described as one who witnesses, right? It's only in the extra Quranic literature that we find shaheed then being translated as a martyr. And, as you remember from the book, you can achieve martyrdom in a number of different ways. Of course, nowadays, if you think of martyrdom in the context of Islam, immediately we think of battlefield martyrs, right? Dying in war, dying during a battle. But shaheed is actually a much broader term outside of the Quran. In the Quran, it's strictly a witness, but then we also find the word occurring in the hadith literature and referring to anyone who dies, say, through great suffering. So if you die from the plague, that might be good news to certain people who may have perished at least the loved ones of those who have perished during COVID. If you die from the plague, if you die from, some other deadly disease and you suffer a lot in the course of that. Women who die in labor during childbirth are also considered martyrs. So martyrdom does not intrinsically have any violent connotations attached to it. It really refers to someone who may die from great suffering. But the broadest definition of a martyr comes from the Hadith literature, and it says, anyone who dies in their bed is a martyr. What does that mean? It means any righteous person who's lived a life of commitment, of righteousness, of adhering to moral principles. At the end of such a person's life, he or she has achieved martyrdom. That's the broadest definition. So that can refer to anybody who's lived an exemplary life. But the further message in that is that it's really up to God, however, to determine. Because, we may see someone passing away, but we have no way of determining whether that person had led a righteous life and so forth, right? That is really God's prerogative alone. Only he can judge, right, whether we have attained genuine martyrdom in that sense. But the broad definition is the one that I actually like to draw people's attention to. It's not the manner of dying. It's not how you die. It's who you are when you die that determines whether you're a true martyr or not. And again, but that judgment is God's prerogative alone.
So the concept as it works seems to be more of an internal motivation, to maybe perhaps make it more universal, but just like I think everyone can understand the idea of finishing strong, right? There are a few things sadder than someone who lives a righteous life and then blows it at the end, a man who's lived faithfully for 20 years and then takes a bribe, for instance, like this idea of finishing to the end, right? Like everyone ends in death, and to end well. That goes even, you can look at Stoic literature. Like, this transcends, like that's a common human experience. And it's funny, even as you mentioned it, I realized that as we talked about shaheed, the original meaning of martyr was witness as well. That's why it's translated that way. Like, well, it was that idea of someone who bore witness to the faith, right?
Yeah.
Which would make sense. But what's happened even in is that the word martyr, it's not so much that it probably is a good translation of shaheed. It's that both of them together have been brought into media in unhealthy ways. Or lopsided ways, maybe would be a better, very lopsided, which is always a shock when the media does that. But anyways, awesome. I want to make sure that I am respectful of your time. Is there any last thing that you would that you want to talk about in regards to your book? Before we conclude.
So will you allow me a shameless plug for my newest book?
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Okay. And so actually, PJ, you may actually find this useful too.
Yes.
Because it's called Jihad. Can you see it? Jihad, what everyone needs to know. It just fell off the press a couple of months ago, also published by Oxford University Press. So I had written to my editor at Oxford and complained that the book wasn't selling well. Well, what do you expect, right? So dense, I admit it. It's extremely expensive. And so, of course, people aren't exactly flocking to buy it, right? And the language is, in many ways, inaccessible, I think, to the ordinary reader. So my editor suggested that why don't you take a lot of that information that's in the book and repackage it and write it in more accessible language and produce a shorter book that might be of greater appeal to the lay reader, in the sense that, an educated reader, of course, but a non-specialist, right? So I would like to draw people's attention to this book. They might find Striving in the Path of God perhaps a little intimidating, but this might be more up their alley. And
We'll
I'm
definitely
still
put a link to
hoping
it
to
in the
attract more
description.
attention. Pardon me? Pardon me?
We'll definitely put a link to it in the description.
Yes.
Because I will say, it was Striving the Path of God was not an easy read. So that's encouraging. I think more people would
that's
find that
exactly what I
attractive.
mean. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's in a question and answer. It's in a question and answer format. So I try to anticipate questions that the average reader might ask and then answer that using, again, a lot of my sources, but repackaging them differently so that it's much more digestible.
Yeah. Awesome. So kind of as we conclude here, and thank you for plugging that book. I didn't realize that just come out. That's awesome. But as we conclude here, what's one thing that you would want to leave to our listeners?
Make the effort. Can I use the word effort again? I guess make the jihad to learn on your own. I mean, sure, you control the internet and you can find a lot of websites. It's something that I warn my students against considerably. But don't forget the art of reading. Pick up something that's reliable. Try to get a holistic view of things. Don't get bogged down in sort of the media soundbite that can often mislead. I'm not saying that the media sometimes doesn't try to do its best, but it's very restricted in what it can do. There is no substitute for a detailed and in-depth exposure to a subject. So don't take the shortcut. Do read my book, Striving in the Path of God, and then, read the kind of the companion volume, Jihad, What Everyone Needs to Know. And I think by using the two sources, you would get a very good sense of, how complex the notion of jihad is, but at the same time, also a very simple notion in the sense that, this is something we're already doing. We're already all carrying out. We don't call it that in our lives, but it is a concept that all of us can relate to at a very basic human level. So if, as I said at the very beginning of our interview too, if the major takeaway from the book and this conversation today is that, oh, now I understand jihad, I can relate to it. It's not scary. It's not about violence and fighting people. It's about trying to make a more meaningful existence for all of us. We're all in this together. And that the struggle to create a better world is our common struggle. And dare I say it, our common jihad. And so that's really what I would like the reader and the listener to get from my discussion.
Really an awesome way to end. Dr. Afsaruddin, thank you so much for coming on today. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you. Thanks very much.